I'm a 34-year-old single mom to two amazing kids, my son, who's 8, and my daughter, who's 5. Life hasn't always been easy, but I've worked hard to build a stable, happy home for us. My brother, Daniel, is 37, married to Jessica, and they have 2 kids, a 10-year-old boy and a 7-year-old girl. On paper, Daniel's life is picture perfect. A 6-figure corporate job, a big house in the suburbs, and a stay-at-home wife who seems to have everything under control. But trust me, it's not as perfect as it looks. Daniel and I have never been close. Growing up, he was the golden child, the one who followed all the rules, got straight A's, and made my parents proud. Meanwhile, I was the rebellious one, the kid who questioned authority, made mistakes, and according to my parents, gave them gray hairs. Daniel loved to rub his success in my face, even back then. He was the kind of brother who'd get an A on a test and make sure to leave it where I'd see it, just to remind me how easy it was to be perfect. Our relationship didn't improve much as adults. Daniel's always had this superiority complex. He likes to pretend he's offering helpful advice, but it's always been a thinly veiled criticism of my choices. When I decided to become a freelance graphic designer, he told me it was a hobby job and asked if I'd thought about what kind of example I was setting for my kids. When my son took up dance instead of soccer, Daniel acted like I doomed him to a life of bullying. And don't even get me started on the time he asked if I was saving for therapy because my daughter's favorite color is black and not pink. That's just Daniel. The most recent family gathering is where things really started to spiral. It was a backyard BBQ at our parents' house, a rare occasion where everyone showed up. My kids were running around with their cousins, laughing and having a great time. But of course, Daniel had to make a comment. Loud enough for everyone to hear, he said something about how I let my kids run wild, and how it's no surprise they never listen to anyone. I laughed it off at the moment because I've learned not to let him get under my skin, but I could feel the judgment from Jessica's side eye as she sat there, probably mentally comparing my parenting to her color-coded chore charts and screen time schedules. Daniel and Jessica are the definition of helicopter parents. Their kids aren't allowed to eat sugar, stay up past 7:30, or watch anything that isn't educational. Jessica is always posting these Pinterest-worthy pictures of their family game nights or homemade science projects, but their kids always look tired. It's like they're being raised in a pressure cooker. Meanwhile, Daniel acts like being a dad is a side hustle. He works long hours and spends most of his time at family events scrolling on his phone, only stepping in to bark orders or criticize someone else. About a week after the BBQ, my mom called me, clearly uncomfortable. She told me she'd heard from some extended family members that Daniel had been saying some pretty nasty things about me. Apparently, he'd been telling people I'm unfit to be a parent because I'm too lenient and that my unstable lifestyle is going to ruin my kids. He even hinted that someone should call Child Protective Services to step in before it's too late. I was stunned. It's one thing to criticize me to my face, but to go behind my back and say things like that, to involve CPS, that's a whole new level of betrayal. A few days later, my worst fear came true. There was a knock at my door, and standing there were 2 CPS workers. They said they'd received an anonymous report about unsafe living conditions and neglect. My heart was racing, but I let them in. They were polite but thorough, asking questions about everything from my kids' diet to their sleeping arrangements. They even spoke to my son and daughter, who, bless them, were confused but cooperative. After about an hour, the workers told me everything looked fine and they'd be closing the case. Still, the experience left me shaken. At the next family event, I decided to confront Daniel. I didn't accuse him outright, but I asked if he knew anything about the CPS report. He smirked and said something about how people just want what's best for the kids, and sometimes it takes an outsider to see the bigger picture. It was all I could do not to scream. My parents were furious when they found out, but they refused to cut ties with Daniel, saying it was important to keep the family together. Jessica, of course, stood by her husband, claiming they'd only ever acted out of love because I'm too selfish to put my kids first. That's when I knew I couldn't trust them. I started keeping a journal of everything, every passive-aggressive comment, every questionable thing I noticed about their parenting. At family gatherings, I started paying closer attention to their kids, who seemed more withdrawn every time I saw them. I didn't know where this was heading, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let Daniel and Jessica get away with this. Update 1. Things started to unravel not long after the CPS visit. I was scrolling through my messages one evening when a notification popped up from someone I hadn't spoken to in years. It was an old friend of Jessica's, someone she'd been close to before marrying Daniel, but had drifted apart from. She started by asking if everything was okay, which immediately made me suspicious. Then she dropped a bombshell. Jessica had been venting about her marriage on private online forums. Apparently, she was struggling with Daniel's controlling behavior and felt trapped. According to the messages, Daniel's need for control extended far beyond the kids. He micromanaged every aspect of their lives, from their schedules to their finances. Jessica had even admitted in one post that she sometimes felt like another one of his children, instead of his wife. The friend didn't have screenshots but suggested I check Daniel and Jessica's social media accounts for clues. That night, I went down the rabbit hole. Daniel's social media was plastered with pictures of their perfect family, vacation photos, holiday dinners, and happy birthday posts. But the more I looked, the more cracks I noticed. Jessica often looked tense, and the kids rarely smiled naturally in the photos. It was like they were performing for an audience. There were also comments from Jessica's personal account that seemed a little off. She would write things like another busy week, but we made it through. Or always so proud of my family, statements that sounded like they were trying to convince someone, maybe herself, that everything was fine. The next family gathering wasn't any better. It was another BBQ at our parents' house, and Daniel's kids seemed exhausted. His youngest kept yawning, and the oldest flinched whenever Daniel raised his voice, even if it wasn't directed at them. They were quieter than usual, too, barely engaging with my kids. At one point, Jessica and I ended up in the kitchen together, and she let slip that her oldest had been having trouble in school. They'd started seeing a therapist for anxiety, but Daniel thought therapy was a waste of time and only allowed it because the school recommended it. That caught my attention. After the BBQ, I decided to dig a little deeper. I reached out to a mutual acquaintance who worked at the kids' school. She didn't give me specific details, but mentioned that one of Daniel's kids had been struggling with anxiety, and a teacher had expressed concerns about the pressure they seemed to be under. The teacher also mentioned the child often seemed tired and on edge, which lined up with what I'd been noticing at family events. Around this time, I reconnected with Jessica's old friend, who shared more troubling stories. She told me that Daniel was known to yell at his kids when things didn't go perfectly. Jessica had once confided in her that Daniel's temper scared her, but she didn't feel like she could leave because she wasn't working and had no financial independence. The friend seemed genuinely worried, and so was I. Daniel must have sensed that I was paying more attention because he started ramping up his attacks. At the next family dinner, I had a single glass of wine with my meal. It was a rare treat since I don't drink much. Daniel, ever the opportunist, loudly commented on how I always have a drink in hand and made a joke about me being the family's resident lush. It was ridiculous, but the way he framed it made it sound like I was an alcoholic. I knew it wasn't just a jab, it was another attempt to undermine me in front of the family. After that, I started researching custody laws and what constitutes neglect or emotional abuse. It wasn't about revenge anymore. I was genuinely worried about my nieces and nephews. I began keeping meticulous records of everything. Every snide comment Daniel made, every detail I noticed about his kids' behavior, and even Jessica's subtle admissions. I saved screenshots of social media posts and started writing down things I overheard at family events. I debated anonymously reporting Daniel to CPS, but I decided to wait until I had enough evidence. I didn't want to risk having my report dismissed or, worse, tipping him off before I could make a real case. The final straw came at another family gathering. Daniel was in full performance mode, talking loudly about how his parenting style was the reason his kids were so well behaved. Then, out of nowhere, he announced that my kids were probably going to end up in juvie if I didn't parent better. The room went silent. I looked over at my parents, who were clearly uncomfortable but said nothing. Later, one of my cousins pulled me aside and admitted she believed Daniel was emotionally abusive to his kids, but was afraid to speak up because of how intimidating he could be. Not long after that, Jessica sent me a cryptic text. She apologized for Daniel's behavior, calling it unnecessary, but when I tried to respond, she quickly backtracked, saying she shouldn't have said anything and asking me to ignore the message. It was clear she was scared. At this point, I started noticing Daniel's hypocrisy more and more. Despite his hands-on dad image, he frequently worked late and left Jessica to handle everything at home. The cracks in his perfect facade were becoming impossible to ignore. I decided it was time to act, not to get back at Daniel, but to protect his kids. The more I learned, the clearer it became that they were the ones who needed help. Update 2. After the last family gathering, I decided it was time to stop playing defense and start taking action. I contacted a family lawyer to discuss everything: Daniel's behavior, his CPS stunt, and my concerns for his kids. The lawyer listened carefully and offered clear advice: document everything and focus on facts, not emotions. She also reassured me that as long as I kept my own parenting spotless, there was no way Daniel's retaliation could jeopardize my custody of my kids. Following her advice, I began reaching out to family members and friends who had witnessed Daniel's outbursts. Some were hesitant to get involved, but others, like my cousin who had already confided in me, agreed to provide written statements. Each account painted a clear picture. Daniel was controlling, quick to anger, and dismissive of his children's emotions. I also reconnected with Jessica's old friend, who came through with screenshots of Jessica's private posts from years ago. These posts described Daniel's yelling, his refusal to compromise on parenting decisions, and her increasing feelings of isolation. The pieces were starting to come together. Then, I had an opportunity to see things firsthand. I casually offered to help Jessica with school pickup one afternoon. She reluctantly agreed, probably overwhelmed and needing the extra hands. As we waited for the kids, I overheard a conversation between her oldest child and another student. The boy mentioned skipping lunch because Dad said I was getting chubby. My stomach turned. Later, I gently asked Jessica about it, and she admitted that Daniel had been obsessing over the kids' eating habits, even going as far as to remove snacks from the house entirely. That was the tipping point. I filed an anonymous report with CPS detailing everything I documented. I kept the focus on the kids, their anxiety, their apparent exhaustion, and the unhealthy pressure Daniel seemed to put on them. A few weeks later, CPS conducted a surprise visit to Daniel's home. While they didn't find evidence of physical abuse, they noted a high level of tension in the household and scheduled a follow-up. Daniel's carefully curated image was beginning to crumble. When news of the CPS visit got back to him, Daniel was furious. He confronted me at a family dinner, loudly accusing me of being behind the report. I denied it, keeping my expression neutral, and he stormed off. The rest of the family was left in an awkward silence, but I noticed a few of them exchanging knowing glances. It was clear that more people were starting to see through Daniel's act. The confrontation seemed to push Jessica to her breaking point. A few days later, she showed up at my house, visibly shaken. For the first time, she openly admitted how bad things were at home. Daniel's yelling wasn't just reserved for the kids, it extended to her, too. He criticized everything she did, from how she managed the house to how she handled the kids' schedules. She confessed that she'd been thinking about leaving him but didn't know where to start. I gave her a list of resources: women's shelters, financial planning services, and legal aid. I also encouraged her to keep her own documentation, texts, emails, anything that could help if she decided to file for divorce. Meanwhile, Daniel doubled down on his behavior. He pulled his oldest child out of therapy, calling it a waste of time and insisting that their problems could be solved with discipline. This only made things worse. Jessica's old friend, who had stayed in touch with me, shared more screenshots of Jessica venting about Daniel's decisions. The messages were damning, with Jessica explicitly mentioning how Daniel's actions were hurting their kids and how powerless she felt to stop it. I also reached out to the kids' teachers, framing it as a concerned relative wanting to ensure the kids were okay. Without prying too much, I encouraged them to document any concerns they noticed. One teacher later mentioned offhand that they'd already been keeping notes after the oldest child broke down in class during a group project. Daniel's public persona started to crack. At the next family event, he lost his temper in front of everyone, yelling at his youngest child for spilling a drink. The room went silent as the child shrank back, clearly scared. My parents looked horrified, but no one said anything, except for Jessica, who quietly led the kids out of the room. Later, a few family members privately approached me, acknowledging that they were starting to see what I'd been talking about. The turning point came when I got a hold of a voicemail. Jessica had accidentally forwarded it to me while we were discussing resources. In it, Daniel berated her for not controlling the kids better, calling her useless and blaming her for their struggles in school. The tone was harsh, the language degrading. It was exactly the kind of evidence I needed to show the extent of his behavior. With the voicemail in hand, I went back to my lawyer. She helped me craft a plan to ensure Jessica and the kids could get the help they needed while protecting myself and my own children from Daniel's retaliation. It wasn't about revenge anymore, it was about accountability and safety. And for the first time, it felt like Daniel's house of cards was about to come crashing down. Update 3. Not long after I received that voicemail of Daniel berating Jessica, things began to escalate quickly. A few weeks later, CPS showed up at Daniel's house again. This time, it wasn't because of my report. One of the teachers at his kid's school had anonymously reached out after noticing that Daniel's oldest had been crying in class and expressed fear of going home. CPS conducted another home visit, which only seemed to amplify the tension in their household. Though no physical abuse was found, the investigator made note of the emotional strain on the children and flagged the case for continued monitoring. Daniel's reaction to this second visit was explosive. He started pointing fingers at everyone in the family, accusing various people of working with CPS to sabotage him. He went so far as to accuse our parents, who had remained cautiously neutral until this point. His paranoia only served to alienate him further from the extended family. Cousins who once defended him began to quietly distance themselves, unwilling to be dragged into his drama. Amid this chaos, Jessica opened up to me again. One evening, she showed up unannounced, looking exhausted and stressed. For the first time, she fully admitted that Daniel's abuse wasn't limited to the kids, it extended to her as well. He would belittle her, blame her for anything that went wrong, and control every aspect of their lives, including their finances. She confessed she'd considered leaving but felt trapped because she had no savings and no support system outside of the family. It was heartbreaking, but it also gave me a clear path forward. We started quietly building an exit plan for her. First, I helped her research local women's shelters and legal aid organizations. Then, we opened a separate bank account in her name, hidden from Daniel, where she could start putting away small amounts of money. It wasn't much, but it was a start. I also put her in touch with my lawyer, who began advising her on the legal steps she'd need to take if she decided to file for divorce and custody. Meanwhile, Daniel began targeting me directly. He cornered me at a family event, his face red with anger, and warned me that he'd make sure I lost custody of my kids if I didn't stay out of his business. I stayed calm, refusing to engage, but I made a mental note to document the interaction. Daniel's threats were empty, but they showed just how desperate he was becoming. Around this time, a new witness emerged. A neighbor of Daniel's approached me at a community event. They'd overheard a heated argument between Daniel and his oldest child, where Daniel had been shouting so loudly that the neighbor could hear every word through their closed windows. They described the language Daniel used as intimidating and said it left them concerned for the kids' well-being. The neighbor offered to provide a statement if it was ever needed, which felt like a significant win. The real turning point came at another family gathering. Daniel's oldest child pulled me aside while the adults were distracted. They admitted they felt scared all the time and didn't like going home. When I gently asked if they'd ever told anyone else, they shook their head, looking terrified of the consequences. It was clear they were desperate for help, but they didn't know how to ask for it. A few days later, I decided to confront Daniel directly in a neutral setting. I carefully laid out what I'd observed, his kids' anxiety, Jessica's exhaustion, and the reports from CPS, and tried to reason with him. Instead of listening, he doubled down, accusing me of being a homewrecker who was trying to ruin his family out of jealousy. It was pointless to argue, so I left, knowing that his refusal to acknowledge his behavior would only work against him in the long run. As Daniel's erratic behavior became more obvious, more family members began siding with me. My cousin, who had previously kept her distance, started actively supporting Jessica. Even our parents, who had tried to stay neutral for so long, began stepping in to support the kids, offering to babysit more frequently and subtly helping Jessica with small errands. With encouragement from all sides, Jessica finally took a significant step forward. She quietly met with a family lawyer who helped her understand her rights and options. She began gathering her own evidence, texts, emails, and even recordings of some of Daniel's outbursts. With my help, she started building a custody case that would stand up in court. Then came the breaking point. At a family dinner, Daniel had a complete meltdown. It started over something small. His youngest child accidentally spilled their drink, but it escalated into a full-blown shouting match. He yelled at Jessica in front of everyone, calling her useless and berated his kids until they were in tears. The room was dead silent, everyone too stunned to speak. Jessica stood up, took the kids, and left without a word. After that, there was no going back. Jessica finalized her plans to leave and began preparing the legal paperwork to file for divorce and full custody. Meanwhile, I compiled all the evidence she'd collected, along with my own notes, to create a comprehensive case against Daniel. Daniel's kids started refusing to participate in family outings, citing anxiety. CPS began visiting more frequently, keeping a closer eye on the household. The family began rallying around Jessica, and Daniel found himself increasingly isolated. Jessica thanked me for my support and promised to see the process through. As we both prepared for what was to come, it was clear that Daniel's carefully constructed facade was crumbling. The worst was still ahead, for him at least. For Jessica and the kids, the future was finally starting to look brighter. Update 4. The turning point came when Jessica officially filed for divorce and requested full custody of the kids. The legal paperwork outlined everything: emotional abuse, controlling behavior, and a toxic home environment. It was the culmination of months of planning, evidence gathering, and quiet determination. Daniel was blindsided. True to form, his first response wasn't self-reflection, it was retaliation. Daniel immediately tried to block Jessica's access to their joint bank account. She discovered this when her card was declined while trying to buy groceries for the kids. Fortunately, we'd anticipated this move. Jessica had already set up her own account with the help of my lawyer, and I stepped in to cover her immediate expenses until she could get everything sorted. It was a small victory, but it gave Jessica the confidence to keep pushing forward. Daniel didn't stop there. He launched a full-blown smear campaign against both Jessica and me, calling family members and mutual friends to set the record straight. He told anyone who would listen that Jessica's divorce filing was a lie orchestrated by me, claiming I'd manipulated her into leaving him out of revenge. He painted himself as a victim, insisting he was just a strict but loving father, and that Jessica was too emotional to handle parenting. It was exhausting, but most of the family had already seen his true colors. The people who mattered weren't buying his story. When the legal proceedings began, Jessica's lawyer came out swinging. The evidence was overwhelming. There were testimonies from teachers who had noticed the kids' anxiety, screenshots of Jessica's private complaints about Daniel's controlling behavior, and documentation from CPS about the emotional strain in the household. Daniel tried to fight back by filing his own custody request, accusing Jessica of being an unfit mother. He even tried to drag me into it, claiming I was orchestrating everything out of jealousy. It was laughable, but it showed just how desperate he was. The most powerful moment came when the kids were interviewed by their court-appointed guardian. Both of them said they felt safer with Jessica and didn't want to live with Daniel full-time. Their oldest even brought up Daniel's habit of yelling and how it made them feel scared. Hearing their voices added weight to Jessica's case and made it clear that this wasn't just a messy divorce, it was about protecting the kids from further harm. When I was called to testify, I kept my focus on the facts. I described Daniel's history of undermining my parenting, his volatile temper, and the effect it had on his children. I presented screenshots, documented Daniel's, and even the voicemail he'd accidentally left, berating Jessica. Daniel's lawyer tried to discredit me, implying that I was biased because of my strained relationship with Daniel, but the evidence spoke for itself. There was no spinning the mountain of proof against him. Daniel's attempts to bring in character witnesses backfired spectacularly. A few people initially agreed to testify on his behalf, but most backed out before the trial. Those who did show up crumbled under cross-examination, admitting that they'd witnessed his controlling behavior or heard about his outbursts. Instead of strengthening his case, they made him look worse. Meanwhile, Jessica received overwhelming support from the community. Teachers, family friends, and neighbors wrote letters attesting to her fitness as a parent and the toxic environment Daniel had created. Even people who had stayed neutral up to this point began quietly siding with her. The tide was turning, and Daniel was losing control. The courtroom drama hit its peak when Daniel lost his temper during a hearing. It started with a minor disagreement about scheduling, but he escalated quickly, yelling at Jessica and even snapping at the judge. The judge warned him to control himself, but the damage was done. His outburst only confirmed what everyone already suspected. Daniel's temper was a major issue, and his home wasn't a safe environment for the kids. The fallout from his courtroom behavior rippled through the family. Those who had been on the fence finally cut ties with him, siding with Jessica and offering their support. Daniel found himself increasingly isolated, and his desperation became more apparent. As the date for the final custody ruling approached, Jessica's lawyer expressed confidence that the judge would rule in her favor. In a last-ditch effort to regain control, Daniel tried to discredit me. He dug up old personal information, stuff from years ago that had no bearing on the case, and tried to leak it to the family. It was a pathetic move, and it backfired spectacularly. Instead of making me look bad, it made Daniel look petty and desperate. The family's opinion of him sank even lower, and I didn't even have to defend myself. His actions spoke louder than any words I could have said. Now, we're in the waiting game. The custody ruling is just around the corner, and there's nothing more we can do. The evidence has been presented, the witnesses have spoken, and the kids' voices have been heard. All we can do is wait and hope that justice prevails. No matter what happens, I know one thing for sure: Daniel's reign of control is coming to an end. The future for Jessica, for the kids, and for everyone he's hurt is finally starting to look brighter. Update 5. The custody ruling finally came in, and it was everything we had hoped for. The judge granted Jessica full custody of the kids, citing the overwhelming evidence of Daniel's emotional abuse and toxic behavior. Daniel was given limited supervised visitation, a decision that hit him hard. The judge also ordered him to attend anger management classes and parenting courses before he could even request unsupervised visits. It was a clear acknowledgement of the damage he had caused, and it was the first real step toward protecting Jessica and the kids from his control. The aftermath of the ruling was not kind to Daniel. His reputation, already shaky after his courtroom meltdown, took a nosedive. The family and community that had once respected him now saw him for who he really was. Even his staunchest allies started to pull away. It was as if everyone realized at once that his strict parenting was just a cover for his controlling, abusive nature. Without his facade of perfection, Daniel was left isolated and humiliated. Meanwhile, Jessica and the kids began their new life. She moved into a smaller but cozy home in a nearby neighborhood, where the kids could stay in the same schools. The change was immediate. The kids seemed lighter, freer. Therapy became a regular part of their lives, and their oldest, who had struggled with anxiety and fear, started to open up more in school and at home. Teachers began reporting significant improvements in behavior and participation. The youngest, too, blossomed in the calmer, supportive environment that Jessica created. The ripple effect of the custody battle reached the rest of the family, too. Relatives who had stayed on the fence throughout the drama began reaching out to me, apologizing for not believing me sooner. They admitted they had brushed off my warnings about Daniel for years, but now, after seeing everything unfold, they couldn't ignore the truth. It felt vindicating, but it was also bittersweet. Their apologies came too late to undo the harm Daniel had caused, but at least they were finally taking accountability. Daniel, of course, couldn't let things go. He attempted to rebuild his image on social media, posting staged pictures of himself during supervised visits with the kids and captions about how much he loved being a dad. But the response wasn't what he hoped for. His posts were met with skepticism and, in some cases, outright ridicule. It was clear that his attempts to save face weren't fooling anyone. The community saw through his efforts, and his once perfect image was permanently tarnished. As for Jessica, she started thriving in ways no one could have predicted. With the weight of Daniel's control lifted, she began exploring her independence. She took a part-time job at a local boutique, something Daniel would have never allowed her to do before, and started thinking about going back to school to finish her degree. Her confidence grew day by day, and she became a role model for her kids in a way she hadn't been able to before. The resolution of the custody battle also had a positive impact on my own family. With the drama behind us, my kids no longer had to witness the tension that had hung over every family gathering for years. They started thriving in their own activities, and our home became a much happier, calmer place. It was a reminder of how much stress Daniel's behavior had brought into all our lives. One unexpected bright spot came from Jessica's old friend, the one who had initially reached out to me with the screenshots of Jessica's online posts. She reconnected with Jessica after the divorce, offering emotional support, and even helping her navigate the early days of single parenting. It was heartwarming to see Jessica rebuilding her support network and surrounding herself with people who genuinely cared about her well-being. Daniel's struggles didn't end with his reputation. The financial strain of legal fees, child support payments, and court-ordered classes started to take its toll. He had to downsize his own lifestyle significantly, selling off the flashy car he used to flaunt at family gatherings and cutting back on the luxuries he'd once bragged about. It was a sharp contrast to the image he had tried so hard to maintain, and it left him with even less power to control Jessica or the kids. Eventually, CPS closed the case, declaring Jessica's home safe and stable. The kids were thriving, and there was no need for further intervention. Daniel, however, remained on their radar, with occasional check-ins tied to his supervised visitation. It was a clear message that the system wasn't going to let him slip through the cracks. Toward the end of it all, Daniel tried to make amends with me. He approached me at a family event, offering what felt like a half-hearted apology for everything he'd done. I listened, but when he finished, I told him plainly that his actions were unforgivable. He had put Jessica, the kids, and me through hell, and no amount of apologies could erase that. I made it clear that while I hoped he could grow and do better, I wasn't interested in rebuilding any kind of relationship with him. As I reflect on everything, it's hard to believe how far we've come. What started as a simple family rivalry spiraled into something so much bigger, but in the end, justice was served. Jessica and the kids are safe, thriving, and finally free from Daniel's control. My own family has found peace again, and the extended family is starting to heal. While there's still a long road ahead for everyone involved, I'm hopeful for the future. For the first time in years, it feels like we're all moving forward, on our terms, and without Daniel's shadow hanging over us.